The tank, holding millions of gallons of molasses, had been groaning for weeks. Rivulets of the viscous liquid was dripping down the metal container and being collected in buckets by children. The citizens of Boston knew that something wasn't right, and multiple times individuals warned Purity Distilling Company that the tank was shoddily built and that it was leaking molasses. The company ignored their complaints, preferring to just paint the tank brown instead of fixing it. But by then, it was too late. January 15th, 1919, the tank exploded, sending millions of gallons of sweet, sticky syrup all across Boston's North End. This is the story of the Great Boston Molasses Flood of 1919. I'm your host, Lauren Powers, and you are listening to Not Your History Class podcast. Our standard education has barely touched upon the depth, violence, and tragedy of human history. My intention with this podcast is to illuminate the parts of our history that have been in the dark for far too long. I want to take a comprehensive dive into our world and to give a different and new perspective on our past. After all, education is our strongest weapon against tyranny. Please note, this podcast contains content and information that may not be suitable for children under the age of 13. Please be advised. Boston Harbor was one of the busiest places in the city. The products that were shipped out of Boston would travel down the East Coast and to Europe. In Boston's North End, there was a massive storage tank, standing 50 feet high and 90 feet in diameter. It contained 2.3 million gallons of molasses. It was built in 1915 due to an increased demand for industrial alcohol during World War I. Molasses had been brought from all over the world, such as Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the West Indies. Companies in the United States, England, and France bought the alcohol to make dynamite and other explosives. Arthur Gell, the treasurer of the United States Industrial Alcohol, also known as the USIA, the parent company of Purity Distilling Company, was put in charge of the project for this massive storage tank. He had no architectural, technical, or engineering experience. He couldn't even read a blueprint. He ignored safety precautions. Before the molasses was set to go into the tank, Gell was supposed to fill the entire tank with water, but instead he only put in 6 inches to test it. It is also important to note that due to the tank being a receptacle and not a building, there was no permit necessary for it to be built, and due to it not being a building, there was also no inspections done by city officials. Ronald Mayville, a senior principal at Simpson, Gumpertz and Heger, an engineering firm, said that he believed that the tank was meant to hold water, not molasses, and that the stress that was added to the tank was due to the molasses. He said that the tank should have been simple and straightforward, and an engineer of that time could have been very capable of building a tank that would be able to hold molasses. 7 days before the flood, the temperature outside was 2 degrees Fahrenheit, and there was a new shipment. Warm molasses was then mixed with the cold molasses, and that started the fermentation process. The steel of the tank was not thick or strong enough to withstand the amount of viscous liquid it was holding. The steel was also meant to contain more magnesium, which is why it was more likely to crack, because magnesium helps give the steel more flexibility in colder climates. This is also ironically the same issue that happened on the Titanic. The steel should have been about 50% thicker than it was. There were reports from passerby that when the tank was full, it would make groaning, shuddering sounds. The molasses would leak when it was being filled, and Purity Distilling Company ended up painting the entire tank brown to hide the molasses that was dripping out of it, rather than repairing the damage. Even children would bring pails to the tank to fill them up. Molasses naturally ferments and produces ethanol, which was used in munitions manufacturing in World War I. Part of the issue, too, was the carbon dioxide, which is another fermentation byproduct of molasses. Due to there being several days before the tank exploded, the fermentation was sped up due to the warmer weather, leading to more carbon dioxide within the tank, and the internal pressure started to grow. One USIA employee had brought his worries to his bosses that the tank was not structurally sound, but they essentially ignored him and just recocked the tank. The molasses was imported from the Caribbean, where it was expected to be used to become rum by the Purity Distilling Company. This was right before the prohibition was written into law. Nebraska ratified the 18th Amendment on January 16, 1919, which banned liquor nationwide. However, the actual amendment was not put into effect until 1 year later. By the time, 33 other states had already started their own legislation for prohibition. This was considered a sort of grace period. That was when the USIA decided to buy all the molasses that they could buy and make all the rum that they could make to sell before the grace period ended and the law went into effect. They were also able to distill alcohol because they had a license to make it for industrial applications. January 15th, around lunchtime at 12:30, it had been a surprisingly warm day, around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and next door to the Purity Distilling Company, workers were loading freight train cars. At the Engine 31 firehouse, the workers were playing cards and eating lunch. When the tank burst, 2.3 million gallons of molasses slogged through the streets at 35 miles per hour. With a 25-high-foot wave, it coated everything and everyone in its path. It ended up killing 21 people and injuring 150, and also killing dozens of horses. Dr. Nicole Sharp, an expert in fluid dynamics, stated that she was surprised that the molasses was able to travel that fast, and her first question was if that was even possible. She stated that the initial wave definitely could have moved at that speed. Dr. Sharp broke it down to two different stages, the first being the tsunami. Molasses is 1.5 times more viscous than water, and since the tank had so much molasses poured into it, it could have stored a lot of potential energy. And when the tank exploded, the potential energy became kinetic energy as it poured into the streets. She stated that, quote, "The fact that the molasses is extremely viscous doesn't matter for the first 60 to 90 seconds. The inertia is so much more powerful than the forces that can be moved by the viscosity." End quote. Dr. Sharp describes the second stage of the flood as, quote, "The inertia runs out as the molasses spreads. That's when viscosity starts to matter." End quote. Essentially, the molasses slowed, but because it was starting to cool down, it became stickier and thicker and caused more individuals to be trapped. When the tank collapsed, witnesses said that hearing the rivets shot out of the tank sounded like machine gun fire. It caved in the building's doors and windows, and the workers that were in the basement of the building had no chance of survival as the molasses flooded into the cellar. The flood wrecked and warped the girders of the Boston Elevated Railway, located on Atlantic Avenue. A rail car had been tipped over, and buildings were knocked off their foundations. The flood even picked up a truck and pushed it into the Boston harbor. The Boston Globe later described the molasses wave to cause buildings to, quote, "cringe up as though they had been made of pasteboard," end quote. Engine 31 firehouse was swept off its foundation. The second story collapsed onto its first. The Cloherty House, which was located nearby, was also swept off its foundation and slammed against the elevated train platform. The house owner, Martin Cloherty, woke up just as the wave had crushed his house, and he watched his home start to crumble around him. He was thrown into the molasses and nearly drowned before he climbed on top of the bed frame, which likely saved his life. He had to use his makeshift bed boat to rescue his sister Teresa, but unfortunately, both his brother and his mother were killed in the flood. The molasses poured through the Boston and Worcester freight terminals, in through the doors and the windows. The workers ended up trapped and died in the flood. Boston Police, Red Cross, and even cadets from the training ship USS Nantucket ran to try and help the victims that were caught in the molasses. They couldn't tell the difference between women, children, and men and those that were stuck in the molasses. When they struggled, it only became more difficult to try and get out. Boston Post wrote, quote, "Here and there struggled a form. Whether it was animal or human being was impossible to tell. Only an upheaval, a thrashing about in the sticky mass showed where any life was." End quote. The Boston Post also wrote, quote, "There was no escape from the wave. Caught, human being and animal alike could not flee. Running in it was impossible. Snared in its flood was to be stifled. Once it smeared ahead, human or animal, there was no coughing off the sticky mass. To attempt to wipe it with hands was to make it worse. Most of those who died from suffocation. It plugged nostrils, almost airtight." End quote. The wave was so bad it essentially pulverized bone. People were crushed and survivors had broken backs and skull fractures. Firefighters and police started to help the survivors, having to wade through the waist-deep molasses that was starting to harden in the cold air. Due to this disaster happening in the winter, the molasses was cool and became difficult for people to escape the tide, according to Harvard University scientists. Stephen Puleo, who wrote Dark Tide, The Great Boston Molasses Flood of 1919, said that the flood made huge front-page news. Quote, "Boston has 7 daily newspapers at the time, and the molasses flood is so big, it knocks off the front page the Prohibition Amendment, which essentially passes the night of the molasses flood. And it knocks the Versailles peace talks, the talks that ended World War I, off the front page." End quote. The cleanup effort was done by hundreds of individuals using hatchets and crowbars to reach people that were pinned by the liquid and the debris. Firefighters had to use ladders, spread them across the flood, and then walk over them to prevent themselves from falling into the liquid. The molasses was thigh-high at certain points. It would end up being tracked all over Boston, and the harbor had a brown tinge that remained until summer. In Engine 31 Firehouse, there were several men who had been playing cards during lunch and were trapped in a small pocket of air on the first floor. The rescuers were able to save all but one after spending hours cutting away the debris and floorboards. The one they weren't able to rescue had lost his strength and ended up drowning. The Boston Evening Globe reported, quote, "Fragments of the Great Tank were thrown into the air. Buildings in the neighborhood began to crumple up as though the underpinnings had been pulled away from under them. The explosion came without the slightest warning. The workmen were at their noontime meal, some eating in the building or just outside, and many of the men in the Department of Public Works buildings and stables, which are close by, and where many were injured badly, were away at lunch." End quote. Rescuers were trying to use sand in order to sop it up. The firefighters had a difficult time cleaning up the molasses, as fresh water was not able to cut through the viscous liquid. Eventually, they realized that salt water works and would allow them to be able to hose the mess into the gutters. The cleanup ended up taking 80,000 man-hours. There was also a mention in the papers of pig farmers from Billerica who came to Boston Harbor to try and take the molasses for themselves, as it is a food product after all. There was really no sort of research done on the environmental impact of pouring millions of gallons of liquid into the harbor. In the early 1900s, there was a belief that the ocean was kind of like an endless garbage can. There is no certainty as to how it impacted the sea life, but there is a similar event that occurred in Hawaii in 2013. An underwater pipe had leaked 233,000 gallons of molasses into the Honolulu harbor. The bacteria were attracted to the molasses and started to grow and reproduce, and eventually sucked the oxygen out of the water. Within a day, there were dead fish all around. It's not possible to really remove the molasses from the water as it is soluble, so it eventually just washed away. But that spill was just 1/10 the size of the Great Molasses Flood. One good aspect is that since the flood happened in January, it is less likely that the bacteria would have been able to spread as fast as it had in Honolulu. The next couple days, workers recovered several bodies and unfortunately had to shoot horses that were struggling in the molasses. There was one man, a wagon driver named Cesar Nicolo, whose body was not found until 4 months later when he was fished out of the Boston harbor. The molasses flood caused $7 million in property damage, which is about $100 million today. A class action lawsuit was filed by 119 plaintiffs against the Purity Distilling Company for the shoddy work on the storage tank. Investigators found that the tank had never been tested for safety and was sloppily constructed. The USIA countered with a statement saying that the rupture wasn't due to shoddy workmanship, but rather sabotage. During this time, there are terrorist groups of Italian anarchists that had been found guilty of bombings across the country. The year prior, in 1918, allegedly a man who didn't identify himself called the USIA and threatened to blow up the tank with dynamite. Purity ended up paying $628,000 in damages and $7,000 to the victims' families. The flood also helped bring about improvement when it came to the government involvement with corporations. Stephen Puleo said, quote, "All the things we now take for granted in the business, that architects need to show their work, that engineers need to sign and seal their plans, that building inspectors need to come out and look at the project. All of that comes about as a result of the Great Boston Molasses Flood case." End quote. This was the first case that expert witnesses such as engineers, metallurgists, architects, and technical professionals were brought to discuss the faultiness of the tank. Some sources say that the investigation took 5 years, while other sources say it took 6 years and involved 3,000 witnesses and 45,000 pages of testimony. Over 1,500 exhibits were brought forth, and the closing arguments took 11 weeks. State Auditor Colonel Hugh Ogden, acting on behalf of the Massachusetts Superior Court in April 1925, ruled that the USIA was at fault for the disaster. He stated that Arthur Gell was not qualified for the project at all, and he didn't bother to include engineers and architects to make sure that the tank would be safe. There were so many complaints that came forward to the USIA previous to the explosion, but those concerns were ignored. After the flood, stricter construction codes were enforced, as it is now required by the Boston Building Department that all calculations done by engineers and architects had to be filed with their plans and their stamped drawings to be signed and reviewed by professionals before permits are issued. This continued to become later standard practice across the United States. Later, the use of molasses for industrial alcohol and for explosives became obsolete as war technology grew and advanced. City inspectors would be scrutinizing the construction before the structures could even be put to use. Zoning laws also separated the industrial areas from neighborhoods. Langone Park now stands where Boston flood has taken place, and the only sign is a commemorative plaque at the park entrance. If you are looking for sources for this episode, please check out our show notes. Transcripts and sources will also be on my website, notyourhistoryclass.com. Researching, hosting, and production and editing is all done by Lauren Powers. Theme song and episode music is done by Mike Meyers. You can find him at the Mike Show 42 on X. If you have any recommendations or suggestions for a future episode, you can direct message me via social media or email me at notyourhistoryclass@gmail.com.